welcome back. Today we're talking about My Brilliant Friend, Season 3, Episode 1. And that was a brilliant first episode. So this season takes place in the 70s. And there are a few things to note. First, they're shooting in more locations, specifically Milan and Florence. And second, there's a new director. And so I was doing some background before the season started. In an interview with Variety magazine, he discussed that they were shooting less on set in comparison to previous seasons. And the visual process was to open the doors and let the real world in. And I think in his interview, he communicated his desire to kind of bridge the gap between the audience and its characters. And it was felt this first episode, right? Like, it was aesthetically pleasing. It was brilliant. You get this kind of, I don't know, it was just stunning to look at. And so I look forward to more episodes. So throughout the season, there will be this theme of leaving, not just leaving the old neighborhood, but leaving oneself behind. And so the episode opens up with Elena, and she's famous. You know, she's signing autographs. She's, you know, her book will be a success, and Nino is there. So she has this success, and this love of her life has just walked back in. And so she is just beaming, you know, from ear to ear. But unfortunately, you cannot escape criticism through success. And so although her book is successful, it's getting a reputation because of the salacious sort of nature of the book. And so this is causing her to doubt her own talents. And despite, you know, being around people who are more open-minded, this has limits. Right, so the confidence she had built and integrating so well with these academic elites and these sort of, you know, upper class people is the same thing that's sort of causing massive insecurities, especially as her book becomes more successful. So we will start with Elena and Nino. So Elena is happy, not just because, you know, people are interested in her book, but Nino has come back. And this whole conversation between the two of them was fascinating. First, they talk about Florence, and Elena notes how she does not like Florence very much. And Nino loves it. And I wonder if the reason Elena does not like Florence is because she feels like she has imposter syndrome, right? So although she's made it on paper, there's still that part of her that doubts if she deserves to be here or deserves to be around the people that she's around. And then they have a conversation about family. And Nino has cut off his family. He doesn't talk to his father anymore, and he's kind of just doing his own thing. And of course, the elephant in the room, Lila, comes up. And a few things to note. I thought it was interesting that Elena does not tell Nino where Lila is working, right? She kind of just gives him the basic facts. Like, listen, she's working, she has a child, they got divorced, that's all you need to know. And then Nino has the audacity to ask, what's the baby's gender? And that threw me for a loop because I thought, like, are you the father? Like, why do you want to know what the baby's gender is? And Nino clearly feels some type of way about Lila, even after all these years, because he just starts going off on her. And in summary, his opinion of Lila is that she's selfish, and that she only thinks about herself. And out of all the comments he made, the one thing that kind of stuck in Elena's mind is that she was all wrong in sex. And so that's all Elena could think about throughout the night, right? She thinks about, how can a woman be all wrong in sex? You know, and this is the question that kind of plagues her. And so despite Nino's, you know, arrogance and clear obsession with Lila, she's still willing to risk it all for Nino, right? Because Elena she has very strong feelings about him. And this is made worse at this dinner scene. And so we get to dinner, and there's a few things to note about this dinner. First, Elena was completely checked out, right? So they're sitting and everybody's having this conversation, and she's just in her own world, right? All she can think about is Nino and the conversation they had and how she wishes she could talk to him further. And at one point she just kind of gets up and excuses herself. And there's this professor sitting there. And this was, you know, he seemed innocent enough at first. And he's trying to get her involved in the conversation. And he's like, what do you think, Elena? And she's like, I don't think anything. And they make this comment how writers always have something to say. And she's like, well, maybe I'm not a writer. And again, I think she has like this imposter syndrome where although she wants to be there, she doesn't deserve it. She feels like she doesn't deserve it. And she goes into the bathroom. And again, all she can think about is Nino, right? And thinking about this professor, it's really interesting. Like, I guess the only time a man is interested in what you have to say is if he wants something. But we'll come back to this man soon. And so when she comes out of the bathroom, she sees her fiance, Pietro. And when she sees her fiance, she looks like she saw a ghost. I mean, she looks like, you know, like just horrified. And I think for Elena, seeing Nino and her fiance side by side was heartbreaking for a lot of reasons, because she kind of compares the two men, right? Like, her fiance is successful, he just got tenure, you know, he's doing very well for himself. And he seems like a nice guy, you know, I don't catch any vibes from him. But I think what I got from Elena is that, you know, success and money, it doesn't really impress her that much. You know, I think Elena is like Lila in a way where she wants love. And, you know, when her fiance, like, it's revealed that he has tenure, there's this conversation about, like, you know, us women, we have to be happy for their success. And I don't think it was the fact that Elena is in competition with her fiance or that, you know, she wasn't happy for her success. It's just, there's such a clear class difference between them. And I think Elena resents the idea that, you know, anyone could think she could be moved by money or by power. And this is a point that's reiterated by her passion for Nino, right? Like, he's so good looking. He's like a rock star in her eyes. And so she was ready to throw it all away for him in like a second. And so sadly, the night ends. And Elena, there's a scene as they're leaving dinner and Nino is walking away and she's just looking after him like she wishes she could continue their conversation. But of course she can't. And so she's forced to walk home with her fiance, and they have this conversation. And again, she makes the point that she doesn't like Florence very much. And they kind of discuss their future plans, right? Like, what do you want to do? And Elena's like, well, I want to teach, I don't want to write. And he's like, why can't you do both? And I think Elena, again, throughout the season will struggle with like imposter syndrome. And I thought it was interesting that he was willing to meet her parents, right? Like, he wants to meet her parents, he wants to get married, and you know, she's kind of ashamed. She's like, listen, my parents are not for you, you are not for them. And it's not until she goes home that we realize why that is. And she kind of ends the night. She doesn't want to sleep with him. She doesn't want to share a bed with him. And again, you know, I don't know how attracted Elena is to her fiance. You know, like, I think she likes him as a person, but he doesn't have that spice that Nino has. So we get to this hotel, and this scene with this professor was just something else. And it was also the beginning of many dangerous and just awkward situations that Elena will be put in because as her book gets more successful. So at first, the request seemed innocent enough. You know, this old man is like, let me walk you up. But something was off, and she knew that something was off. And I don't think people understand the anxiety that women have between balancing our survival instincts and then our feminine instincts to be polite. You know, it's always this dangerous line where if you don't balance it correctly, you could lose your life. And so he hugs her and he talks about her book, and you know, she pushes him away because he was really kind of coming on to her. And this was an interesting commentary on like class and, you know, woman being a woman in that time, because regardless of whether you're rich or poor, Elena is still a woman and she wrote a book about sex, right? So it doesn't matter where you come from, people are gonna try you. And so she's heartbroken. She goes into her hotel room, she's crying, and all she can think about is Nino. Like, you know, when he disappeared, it was as if life itself disappeared. And I was like, you know, I'm sure she doesn't feel that way by the end of the episode, but she was just heartbroken. With that, Elena decides to go home. And this scene with her mother was so funny because, again, I think we're going to get less scenes in the neighborhood. And so she comes home and her mother is just ripping her apart, being like, you know what, I could have been you. You ain't like, who do you think you are? You know, what do you think this is? And again, you know, she has this like love-hate relationship with her family. And so Elena, she has two problems in terms of like coming home. First is this wedding or lack thereof. So she basically has to break it to her parents that the man that she's about to marry does not want a church wedding. He wants to get married, you know, through a civil process. And telling that to your traditional parents is insane. To this day, it's insane. You're not getting married in a church. And I think for her parents, like they look at Elena and they're starting to see someone they don't recognize. And this news just makes it worse. And her mother was like, I don't care if he's president of the free world. Not getting married in a church is like, you know, you're damning yourself to hell. And this idea of like separation between church and state is not something that is widespread, right? So her parents are just like, what are you even talking about? And her dad comes in to defend her. And her dad's logic is interesting because he's always been her biggest fan. You know, he's the one who's just kind of allowed her to continue. And his logic is, listen, I trust him because he's rich. And this idea that you trust someone because they're rich is true to this day, right? And as far as they're concerned, Elena has made it, right? And if getting married in a civil process is what it takes for her to marry above her class, then as far as her father is concerned, that's something that she has to do, right? This is a guy that a lot of people would love to marry. And the way her father framed it is interesting. Like, Elena would be lucky to marry him. You know, like at this point, we just need to finish the job. And so Elena is just like, she's struggling because at some point these two families have to meet. And that's something that's kind of weighing in the back of her mind. Aside from dealing with her parents, she has to deal with like fame in the neighborhood. So the reviews are rolling in and they're both good and bad. However, you know, as far as the neighborhood is concerned, Elena is, up until this point, has been very successful, kind of a poster child for sending your child to school. But now that she's written a book that's garnering quite a reputation, this is like, you know, this is going to cause some problems for her. And so people's sort of attitude towards her has changed because she's been in the background for so long. And now she's in the forefront, but she's getting a lot of unwanted attention, right? And you see that right away with this scene with Michael. So he kind of like tells her, she's reading a bunch of newspapers. He's like, come have a coffee with me. And he was so aggressive, right? She said no at first, and then he was like, no, seriously, come. And she's like, okay. And again, the perception of Elena has changed, right? Like she went from being kind of a modern, educated woman to a free woman, right? And kind of letting your daughter go to school and leave the neighborhood. Look what she's writing. You know, like you've kind of produced a daughter who has no moral values, and this is something that's weighing in the back of her mind. And so Michael calls her in. He's like, we need to have like, how are you? Being super aggressive. And so there's two theories going around. One is that Elena really, you know, people are saying that she lives this free lifestyle. And the other is Michael, where he's convinced that Lila and Elena had come to some type of arrangement where Lila does the dirty stuff and Elena writes about it. And Elena's like, what are you talking about? That doesn't even make any sense. But of course, you know, like, again, she's getting more popularity. And the reason people want to read the book is to find out what's in it, right? So it's not so much about like, oh, this is a great story. It's like, ooh, what's in it? And so this is really starting to affect her reputation in the neighborhood. And finally, it gets to her family, right? It gets to her brothers. They're having fights in behalf of, you know, to save her name. And her brothers are going off. She's like, what are you going to do when your father finds out? And she leaves before her father, you know, can confront her, because I think for Elena, like, her father eventually is going to find out about this book. And his reaction should be interesting because, again, he's been her biggest supporter. And they sent her off to study and to write something like this. It's hard to wrap your brain around. And there's this scene where she's about to go home, and then she imagines like the whole city like shaming her and just, beating her up and, throwing her to the wind. And of course she runs away before that can happen. And this transition to Milan was so beautiful and so like effortless, right? Because her neighborhood almost hasn't changed, right? People there are concerned with everyday life, raising their kids, survival. And then you get to Milan, which is like a whole different vibe, right? Like politics there is everything. You see red everywhere. Like it's beautiful, it's lively. You got young people, you got rich people. Like it's a whole different energy. So I like the contrast, it was just like a seamless transition. And again, I think it speaks to like the aesthetics of this director. And so she gets to Milan and she's supposed to give a talk about her book, but of course no one in Milan cares about her or knows who she is, and she's relieved, right? As far as people in Milan are concerned, I mean, it is what it is. So she decides to stick around and, listen to one of her ex-lovers sort of speech about like, again, it's very political. You got these students there, and she gets there and she's just like one of the crowd. And this guy, one of her ex-lovers, his name is Franco, he's making a speech. And, in that speech, he's talking about educating the working class and making sure that those fortunate enough to get educated in this country do not fall victim to the ranks of capitalism. And again, it speaks to this tension, right? Because her ex Franco, from what I recall, he was very rich. And Elena, at the time that she met him, like she was still kind of learning this world. And he was one of the people that kind of, he helped her gain access to certain circles that perhaps she wouldn't have had access to. And so again, like politics is for the rich, right? Like, you have these kids and they're in school and, meanwhile, like in Elena's neighborhood, people are working and they got other problems. And so she's listening to his speech and she's kind of thinking about their times together. And so she's sitting there and Elena is kind of observing different things. So her ex-lover, he's kind of like a rock star. And she's noticing, the first thing she notices is these group of girls who are just like in awe of the things he's saying, because these sort of young political, leaders, like for them, these are their rock stars, right? So they're looking at this guy and he's cute and he's rich, so I get it. And then she notices this baby, this mother and her baby, and she kind of notes that, she's there, she's participating, but at the same time, she can't really do much because she has a child. And so this baby is going to become super important by the end of the episode. After the speech, she gets invited to this after party, and her goal in going to this after party is to prove to this man that she's come a long way, right? She wants him to acknowledge that she's glowed up, right? She's no longer this little girl that he was, seeing back in the day. And so they have a few conversations. The first, of course, is about Lila. And I find it interesting that everyone that Elena knows about Lila. She's such a part of her personality that you cannot be friends with Elena without knowing about Lila, right? And I think Elena is just haunted, not just by where Lila is now, but what does Lila think of her book, right? That's something that's plaguing her. And even her ex-lover is like, how's Lila? And she tells him. And I thought it was interesting that she told him everything, like she's working at a meat packing facility, she's divorced. And I don't know what her goal was in telling him all this information. Was it to compare herself, to be like, well, that's how she's doing, let's focus on how I'm doing? Like I was trying to read between the lines there, but I wasn't sure. And she's kind of jealous a bit, right? Because he's like, well, maybe I should, we should keep in touch. And she's like, with her or with me? So the fact that she even thought that is very strange. But again, I thought it was weird that she just kind of dumped Lila's information like that. But you guys let me know what you think. Then they have a conversation about her book. And Franco's opinion of her book, I think, says it all, And his review was as follows. He said, you use tales of romance and social climbing to hide what's really worth saying. And he's like, basically, you did the best you could, girl. And I don't know if that was, like, he doesn't really elaborate, you know, he just kind of stops himself. But I wonder if what he was saying was like, listen, although, you know, you're educated and I congratulate you on making it this far, you know, there's one thing to be successful, but it's like how? And a book like this, especially during this time, and you're female, in terms of like these academic circles or this like the rich, like this would not be considered legitimate work, right? Like Elena's work, because it talks about sex in the open, you just don't talk about these things, you know, out loud. And so I don't know if what Franco was saying, like, you know, you could have made a point, but instead you kind of, I guess you did what you could. So again, it's an interesting conversation to have about like class and being a woman, because in that moment, he kind of established a hierarchy, I feel, by saying, you know, it was good, but it's not worthy, right? Like you didn't really talk about what needs to be talked about, so, you know, I congratulate you on your success. Like that's kind of what I got from him. And so they shake hands and they're off to bed. And this whole bed scene was insanity. She goes to bed and she can overhear Franco and his girlfriend having, you know, they're having a great time. And then this painter comes out of nowhere. And when they entered the house for this after party, and, you know, they were kind of going around the house, there was a joke made. Like the same guy was, I think he said something like, do you know a lot about art, painters or paint? Something along those lines. Like it was some type of innuendo. And then he just walks into her room and he's like, can I sleep with you? And she's like, get away from me. And he was so aggressive. And I really thought she was going to be assaulted. You know, like I really thought like he was, first he tried it and then he got super angry that she rejected him. You know, and his whole logic is like, you're an artist. I thought you were a free woman. Like you can use this to write, you know, more of your diaries or whatever it is you do. And, you know, thankfully he left, but what essentially legitimized his request is this book of hers, right? And in that moment, she kind of has like a conversation with herself where she's like, you know, I would have slept with Nino, but that's passion. But like sex for sex's sake, you know, this conversation about like meaningless sex, because a lot of these encounters that Elena's having, you know, it's because they think she's a free woman. And there is a difference between sleeping with people that you built an emotional connection with over time and then meaningless sex, right? Sex for sex's sake. And for Elena, like that's a distinction that's clear, but not for men, not of any class. And again, this guy was a painter, that other guy was a professor. So, I mean, it didn't really matter what their backgrounds were, like they just tried it. And so we get to the end of the episode. You know, she's awake now, she's traumatized, and she can hear this baby crying again. And so she goes to comfort this mother, and they have this conversation. And this conversation reveals what we have all suspected, which is that Nino is trash. You know, I've never liked Nino, but I was like, how did we know it was his baby? Even before she said it was his baby, I knew it was his baby. And so Nino, you know, this mother, she's talking about her pregnancy, right? How she didn't really want this child. And the reason that she had this child is because she was too much of a coward to admit that she was afraid of an abortion. And so she went through with having the baby. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the father of the child, Nino, in the beginning, he was super supportive. But as the relationship progressed, she was kind of disgusted. Not just with him, but the fact that she could have ever liked someone like him. And I think that's always interesting, where I've had that experience where you're very attracted to someone and then it goes away. And not only does it go away, you're actually disgusted with yourself. Like you wonder, how was I even attracted to this person? Like it's that kind of, which is why you shouldn't, like you get the sense that this mother and Nino, like they had a very passionate relationship, which is what Nino seems to be good at, but it fizzled out, you know, and when attraction is the only thing holding you together, it doesn't last long. And so Nino left and she was left stranded with this baby. And, you know, the fact that she was like, everybody knows who he is, like he has a reputation. Elena's face when she said Nino's last name, like she looked horrified. Like she looked like, you know, she looked like this woman was describing her husband or something. Like she had this kind of, this instinct of like, no, you know, like this can't be true. But sadly it is. And that's where the episode ends, right? Elena is disgusted. She just looked horrified. There's just the feelings of emotion. So overall, I thought this was a good episode, great episode. I like the conversation that this series invites. And so I'm excited to see you all every week. And you guys let me know what you think. And until next time.